you here. Thanks for coming so much, and so are so many Embrace Race folks, of course.
Yeah, we've got here Portland, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ontario, Burlington, all over, New Haven. A lot of people came in. Yep.
You know, and I'm wondering, how did you come to this work? So of course there's a need, and obviously you recognized it, and yet, you know, why you? Why 2006? Give us a little backstory on that.
Okay, a little backstory. I was a teacher in New Mexico. As you noted, I had a teaching degree, so I was a teacher, and then I became a mom. So I quit teaching, and all the books that were in my classroom library became my daughter's books. And I started working more closely with the people at the Pueblo in our tribal nation on family literacy kinds of activities. So when I started thinking about grad school, I thought, well, I'm going to study family literacy. So moved to Illinois and started coursework with that in mind, but there was a mascot at the University of Illinois, Chief Illini Wick, that that I would end up doing. It's a stereotypical mascot, and I was trying to think, what is this thing, and why do people think it's so wonderful when it was clearly not wonderful at all? So I shifted from thinking about family literacy to thinking about how and what are people seeing in their books that make them think this is a good image, this stereotypical image of a Native person. It's not even really a Native person, it's a fiction of who we are. So it was kind of a culture shock to come here and think like, wow, these people really don't know a whole lot about why stereotypical imagery is bad for all of us. So I started looking at images of Native people in children's books. So shifting from that family literacy to images of Native people. That became the work that I do, pretty much 24/7, because books are everywhere. Books really matter to parents. Parents read to kids at bedtime, and the books that they're choosing to read to their kids at bedtime or in the morning, at breakfast, wherever and whenever they choose to read, really matter, because these are people that love their children, giving their children information in the books that they're using with them. And so I really felt that I could make an intervention in what people know about Native people by way of talking about the books that they use with their kids. Hold on, I can't hear you guys.
Sorry. When you say 24/7, this is what you do 24/7. I believe you as a follower of yours on Twitter. And I wondered, you spoke a little bit about it, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what's at stake, because in addition to, helping people find excellent books, that are true to the people they're trying to represent, you also, you're also known as a diversity Jedi, right?
Yeah.
Your Huge on Native Twitter, which is also Twitter. You're commenting on all kinds of things that happen every day that aren't really directly in children's books, right? So I just wonder, if you could speak about sort of your broad activism.
Yeah, I hit on something sometime last year or the year before that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. The idea was that in most of the schools in the United States, there is a month for a particular group. So for Native people, that's November. A terrible month for us to be in, because that's Thanksgiving and that's long ago, far away. Stereotypes, not good content associated with that. But and so for a Native child, that's kind of when the Native content appears in the school curriculum. So that child only counts in the school curriculum in November. Meanwhile, non-Native children, white children especially, are affirmed their existence as kids who play in the neighborhood, who go swimming, who go camping, do all the things that kids do. Their life is affirmed all year long. Wherever they go and whatever they do, in books, in movies, in toy products at the store, they will find some semblance of their existence as a person of the present mirrored or reflected back to them. And that's not the case for Native people. We are Native people all year long, every day. That isn't something that happens only one day or 1 month of the year. And so it is a 24/7 experience. Every time I open my eyes in the morning, what I see on the news or on Twitter, it all impacts the work that I do, because I think, okay, here is an opportunity to talk about how this museum mural that's in the news in the New York Times can help people understand some of what I'm getting at, that we see these things all the time and our children see these things all the time. And we need to make what they see reflect their lives in a good way, in the same way that non-Native children have that experience all the time.
And Debbie, you know, when you talk about representation of Natives in books and in children's books in particular, you know, I know there are a number of dimensions. So some of the most obvious ones, right? Yeah, are Native characters in the books at all? You know, who's
Right.
writing the books? Who's illustrating the books? How are they being presented stereotypically, or you know, with more nuance? The variation across tribal nations, right? All of those sorts of things. When you look at that sort of more holistic picture of representation of Natives, between 2006, when you started American Indian and Children's Literature, and now, over these last 13 years, what do the trends look like to you?
Well, now more than before, because of my blog and because I am quite active, I do have attention from the publishing industry. I hear things like, well, we don't want Debbie to see this, or things like that, because they know I will say something about them. So I think there are some changes that are happening. There is a sense of fear. There's also a lot of white writers say, well, you mean I can't write about that stuff? And I said, no, you can write about it, but if you don't do it in a good way, or if you have factual errors or stereotypes, I'm going to say something about that. So using my platforms to try to get this information out there has, I think, made some differences. It would be hard to quantify, because there are more representations of Native people in children's books and chapter books and young adult novels, I think, than there are of anybody, but they're mostly misrepresentations, and I can't possibly see them all because there are so many. So we have little things like when someone, a young adult novelist will have Low Man on the totem pole in their book, and then someone will say, have you seen what Debbie Reese said about that? And they will go and they'll look, and they'll be embarrassed and grateful to have the information. And then they will write to their editor and say, next time we print this, can we take that out? So I know about some of that because they tell me, but I think it happens a lot more than I know. And I think it doesn't happen at all too, because there's, sometimes it feels like myself and the other diversity Jedi have a huge impact, but we are just a little tiny group trying to affect change. So there has been change, and I think there are more Native writers getting published now than there were in 2006. They are still being published mostly by small publishers, by tiny publishers. And what that means is that we can have all these wonderful books, but all it takes is one Simon & Schuster book with problematic representations throughout to kind of erase and wipe out and obliterate all the good that 10 children's books from a small publisher can do. So these major publishers are doing a lot of damage, and that's where we really need to push very hard on. And so I spend a lot of time on that in particular.
Well, that was, so when we met you, or you wrote us, Debbie, about a list that we put on Facebook, and it was a Mighty Girl list. And,
oh gosh.
Yeah,
is that how we met?
Yeah, that is. I mean, that's not how I was your fangirl, which you told me not to be.
Right, don't do that.
But then you wrote and said, look, there's this list is really problematic, and we forward lists that we don't always know the books to, because we're not list makers, so this is like on social media.
Didn't know all the books.
Yeah, not all of them. So so we really appreciated that, and we changed it and all of that. But I think it's really what you said about having. I have heard of people say, or heard tell, that you have so much power you know,
Yeah.
industry. And I think it's sort of funny. I mean, that these big publishing, I mean, I think it's funny and it's great
Yeah.
that you were able to be so effective in this kind of David and Goliath situation. And I wonder if there are any lessons from that that you would, I don't know, that you'd like to share for other people who just think, but they're so big, you know, what can I do? I know we saw, finally met in person, Zetta Elliott,
Oh, she's wonderful.
a week
Yeah.
or so ago, and she gave a great presentation about sort of how to sort of resist, you know, and create something different and have a voice in publishing and self-publish and all that. So there are these ways, but I wonder what you would, what do people not know that you would sort of tell them about being a
Um,
Jedi or activist?
people tend to say things that are very well meaning, but that are off. Like, thank you for your tireless work. You tirelessly work. I get really tired. And it's exhausting work.
Yeah.
And so I would like other people to do the work as well.
Yeah.
And keep website and learn what's wrong with Little House on the Prairie, they can keep that info inside of themselves, or they can share it. I really want them to share it. I really would like to see people go to their bookstore and say, did you know this has stereotypes in it? And I was going to buy this book, but you know, there's stereotypes in it, and it's not good for my kid, and it's not good for Native kids, and I'm not going to buy it. And the outcome of an interaction like that between a customer and a sales representative or a clerk at the store is there's little ripples that go from there. So that clerk is maybe going to make a report to the manager that they had a customer in there, they didn't like this book and why. And so these are little ripples of information that are going out. And I would really like to see more people do that. What I'm talking about is stepping up and speaking up so that it doesn't fall on a few people, on a very tiny group of people. We have to have way more people doing that. And customers have a lot of power. I mean, this country runs on that dollar. So using your dollars and your voice to share what you learn from my website or from writings or from other people is really important.
Yeah, I found it effective to go in with a list to, you know, a library or bookstore. The librarians in the children's library near us, we told them that you were going to be on, and they're like, Debbie Reese, and they have so many of the books that you recommend. So we were glad about that. Although, like you said, it's harder with the smaller the publisher. They tend to not have those as readily.
Right. And one thing that I think people can do too is that when they learn about a book from a small publisher, is they can go to their library and ask for it. And if the library doesn't have it, then they will try to get it, even though it's from a small publisher. But also maybe donating, seeing if your library will accept copies of books or funding to go towards small publishing, books from small publishers. I think there's a lot of creative ways that people can try to get those books into the libraries.
Debbie, you've started to touch on these, but what is the sort of starter list? And you did prepare a tip sheet for us, which is up already, so people can check that out going forward on our website at embracerace.org. But what is the starter list of criteria, you know, for distinguishing the good from the bad?
Well, there's many strands of that, but one of the things that I ask people to think about is that we are people of the present day. So when you're looking for children's books about Native people, I'd like you to look for books by Native writers. There is no guarantee that a Native writer is going to do better in telling a story about his or her own tribal nation than a white person would, but it stands to reason that they will, especially if that's a part of where they grew up. So today we're calling that Own Voices. It's a hashtag Own Voices, and I encourage people to get books by Native writers. They can do a lot with that, because not only do they have a book by a Native person, they can say, this book is by Cynthia Leitich Smith. That's Jingle Dancer. And the use of that word is puts us right in the present day. Far too many children's books are long ago, far away, set in the past. So that's what we're pushing very hard against. Using Own Voices lets you push against that. So that's one thing choosing Native writers because they're doing own voices stories. And they are more likely also to be tribally specific, to name their nation. That's really important. And I've been using nation, and I realized we probably didn't talk about that enough at the beginning. But Native people were and are citizens or tribal members of nations that existed before the United States existed as a nation. There's words that people are reading in their textbooks when they're little kids, that word treaty. We as adults know what a treaty is. It's an agreement between heads of state. Well, that was happening way back in the 1600s and the 1500s between European nations and Native nations. These agreements were being made. And you don't make these kinds of agreements with primitive people. You make them with intellectual heads of state. So the idea of what treaty really embodies is important for people to really just spend a little bit of time thinking about that, because that kind of gets lost in the overwhelming image that we all get of half-naked Indians running around in the forest, chasing and living with animals in a way that suggests that it just wipes out the whole possibility that we would have this thing called nationhood, sovereign nations, that we had societies that had trading networks with other nations, that we had languages and stories and religions and ways of doing everything that people in any society does. So really need to hit on that nationhood status, that we were sovereign nations.
Well, that brings us to something we were talking about a bit earlier, and of course, we're Embrace Race, and about the particular situation of race and Native peoples. When we say race, we mean, sort of something that's mostly used to divide, and not something that's very logical. And we talk about people being racialized. So it can be, a color of skin thing. It can be due to religion. It can be due to Native status. It can be because of the language you speak, and oftentimes it's a combination. So I just wonder how you square, or how do people get confused about race and nationhood?
Well, I think when my thinking about that is rooted in graduate school and teaching in a college of education, going through the multicultural textbooks and articles and such not, where if you think about it like a chart, and across the top of the chart you have different underrepresented groups, and generally speaking in the United States that is African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. And then on the other grid axis you have like food, clothing, these kind of material aspects of who any people might be. And you can fill in those grids with those characteristics of those people, but there is no nationhood grid, nationhood line in that grid. So that doesn't even get taught. And that's a key piece of who we are. Now, there's all kinds of ways that we present in terms of what we look like. You're looking at me and I have darker hair and I have darker skin, but there are Native people who don't have darker hair and darker skin. And they are Native, because what makes a Native person is not what you look like. It's about your nation and how your nation has determined who its citizens will be. And that's different for all of the different nations that we're talking about. Early, when we opened, you said over 500. That's over 500 different nations, each of whom has their own way of determining who their citizens will be, based on their history and their interactions with other nations. So you have some nations that are fairer in complexion and hair color, and you have some that are not. You have some that are taller. There's such a range of appearance that when we default to the idea that Native people have a culture of teepees and bows and arrows and dark skin and dark hair and high cheekbones, we're really shrinking who we are as a people into a very narrow and stereotype existence.
Right, and then so there's no way to be half Nambe Pueblo, for example.
Is there a way to be half American?
Exactly.
right? I think that's one way that we're pushing back on that. People say, well, you're only 50% Native American. And I say, no, I'm 100% Native American. Are you 50% American? People, no, because we're talking about citizenship, not who your parents are. Now, who your parents are matters in nationhood, but those are two different ideas that get squashed together and really kind of mess with us. Yeah.
It's really helpful.
This may be we had a lot of questions submitted in the during registration, and unfortunately I can't find the one I'm thinking of, so it may be a bit vague, but it was someone who had adopted a child who is not tribally enrolled, she said, and wonders, right, what does this mean for how she can support this child in his identity? Again, that's a very...
Wow. Yeah, that's a really dicey one, because she should know about the Indian Child Welfare Act, first off, because if she has adopted a Native child, or if anybody adopts a Native child, they should know about this federal legislation that came about in the 70s, I think, because Native children were being removed from their mothers, from their homes, being declared to be unfit to raise these children, and the numbers were astronomical. Native people went to Congress and got some laws passed, and so we have this Indian Child Welfare Act. A lot of people don't know about it. They adopt a child who, for one reason or another, they think is a Native child, and when you are adopting a Native child, you're in really slippery spaces with this law, because the tribal nation has the authority to enter into the conversations about where a child will be placed. So that's been in the news a lot in the recent years, because we have people in the country who will think, well, that child's got blonde hair and blue eyes and it's only 1/32 Choctaw, so this doesn't matter. And that's a total misread of what it means to be a citizen of the Choctaw Nation. And it undermines not only that child's well-being as a citizen of that nation, removed from that nation, but it undermines the well-being of the nation itself. Because if all your children get taken from you, then you cease to exist as a nation. So what can she do? First, she better read about that act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and make sure that she's not in a slippery space, because these do end up in court, and that's unhappy and unpleasant for everybody involved. So if it is a Native child who you did go through the Indian Child Welfare Act and they are placed with a non-Native family, then I think that a parent should, again, go to that website and see what kind of resources are there for that. But if, for example, it was a family down the street that had adopted a Pueblo child, I would hope that they would be looking for materials about Pueblo people, that they would go out to New Mexico, where most of the Pueblos are, and spend some time there, and do what they can to affirm that child's identity as a citizen or a person of that nation.
So let me take us back a moment to the criteria. Okay. Debbie, thank you for that. Let me take you back to the criteria, and we have a lot of questions around books in particular. But one question was about your point that if, preferably people would be buying books, illustrated by, written by Native writers.
Yes.
Now, so does this mean, are you saying that to books about Natives written by non-Natives, you would take that as a flag?
I would, absolutely. It is actually quite rare that I find a book that is by a non-Native writer that is one that I would say, here, you can use this one. Okay. And I can tell you some that I would recommend right now. Daniel Jose Older is writing middle grade novels that have Apache characters in them, and that he's working very hard on it, and those are good. I would recommend those, but those are rare, very rare. It's very rare for me to find those kinds of books.
And are there others? We had a question about was looking especially at books by, I mean, you've sort of answered the question in saying that there are very few that you
Yeah.
certainly would personally recommend, but this person wanted to know, in addition to your site, where can, what trustworthy sources, not only of books, but of criteria, right? Maybe of reviews of books about Native Americans might she go to find out, to get good recommendations?
One thing she can do that everybody should also do is become familiar with the American Indian Library Association. I'm a member of the association, and I guess in the 90s we started talking about having an award. And so I worked with other people in the association and came up with a set of criteria on how we would identify books that we thought merited an award from the American Indian Library Association. So their website, I think it's AILA.net, has a page about awards, and you can read the criteria there on what to look for. I don't have that actually on my website. I have some pieces of that when I'm reviewing certain books, but definitely that's one place that they should go. Now, we're not monolithic either in how we feel about certain things. Like the American Indian Library Association awarded a book that has a lot of made-up dialogue of a person that lived a long time ago, a Native person that lived a long time ago. I think it was Sitting Bull. And I personally and professionally don't like those kinds of books, making up dialogue, thoughts, emotions, and feelings about someone who lived a long time ago. It feels a little bit sketchy to me. I'd rather people not do that. But anyway, the American Indian Library Association is one, and Cynthia Lytick Smith, her website blog is Sensations. That's another very good resource. She doesn't look just at Native books, though. She looks at a lot of books.
I'm just trying to get some of those in the chat.
Let me ask, here's another question. And again, folks, if you'd like to submit your questions to the Q&A, please do. We'll be going with your questions from here on out. So here's another from Susan. She says, I'm a curriculum developer. Beyond identifying realistic and respectful books for children, I'm seeking guidance on story-related activities. That is, how to engage children further in a story they've been offered about Native peoples. What activities can deepen children's experience of a story and remain respectful, inclusive, potentially meaningful, and not harmful or culture appropriating? And, Debbie, feel free, you don't, of course, have to identify specific practices, which surely, there's a number of things you can do or not do with different age groups. There are all sorts of things.
I'm going to see if I can get this book off this pile without knocking the pile down.
Yeah, if there are resources, again.
Yeah, this is a great resource for people to use. Lessons from Turtle Island, because it does have picture books for early childhood classrooms and activities to go with them. And it has lots of writing from the authors that talk about why you should not do X, Y, and Z, like making totem poles or making dream catchers, those kinds of activities that are very popular in early childhood classrooms that are actually over there like in very sacred spaces. So this book goes over that a lot. We do have, that's a big problem in early childhood classrooms, the idea of making something and letting kids through their tactile interactions with materials come to know more about people. I don't think that really works. I think I don't think that really happens. It's just an activity, and I think it would be better to spend that time with kids doing something else. So anyway, that book that's a good book for that. Another kind of activity that I see a lot that is highly problematic is taking what someone thinks is a Native folk tale and turning it into a writing exercise so like How Chipmunk Got His Stripes, okay, thinking of a book like that, and reading it and then saying, now you make a story in the classroom, a writing exercise. But these stories are creation stories. They should have the same respect that people give to Genesis. We don't bring Genesis into the classroom in a picture book and then say, now you make a story like Genesis. We understand that it's a sacred story and we don't mess with it. That doesn't happen with Native stories. When they're shelved over with the folk and fairy tales, they seem like Little Red Riding Hood. It's not a big deal. It's just a story. It is not just a story. That's a huge double standard that we have that we really need to push back on. And those kinds of books really, they really collapse what kids can do.
I just want to say I had this experience just a couple weekends ago. I was at a fair, like an engineering fair for undergraduates, and they were creating different sort of mechanical things that were pretty cool. And one of them was they had to turn kind of a myth or folklore, you know, into some sort of mechanical representation. And there was this group that did a native story, and they really went sort of bent over backwards, really thinking that they were being super respectful.
Yeah.
And but they called it a myth, and I said, I like your, you know, the mechanics of these gears, amazing, but you know, Jesus Christ is a myth, you know, to lots of people. So it just, you know, if you're Native American, would you call that a myth? So it's sort of a thing that is very, very common among well-intentioned people like us. And that's sort of the problem, right?
Right.
We always talk about the well-intentioned folks, you know, are what's most worrisome, right?
Yep, it is.
You know, this, again, I hope I'm not taking us away, but this, you're making me think about, I mean, I've thought about before, and you're making me think more about Native American as a term, period, right? The context in which it's useful. So clearly there is something in common, right? A relationship, you know, that pre-existed, you know, in the birth of the United States as such, you know, a relationship, you know, the sort of nation-to-nation relationship with the United States, you know, with the federal government. You know, there are commonalities as to circumstance, right? Although there's also a wide range of circumstance. But I'm just wondering, you know, in what context do you talk about Native Americans, you know, as opposed to, you know, separate nations, right? Particular units. And a perhaps related question that I'm sure you've heard often that we got here is about really what's the right terminology? And I know there's lots of disagreement, but people want to know, is it, you know, for you at least, you know, American, Native American, what do we say?
I use Native American and American Indian and Indigenous and Native. When I'm talking about the larger group of people who are indigenous to this land. When I am, but the best practice always is to be tribally specific. So when people are talking about me, people who are here tonight or who will watch it later, when they sign off and go out into the world, into the classrooms, rather than saying, I listened to a lecture or webinar with Debbie Reese, she's a Native American, I would rather they say, with Debbie Reese, she's tribally enrolled at Nambe Pueblo, because they're going to say, what? What? And that's an opportunity for that person to share what they learned tonight that I haven't talked about yet, but that Nambe is one of 19 pueblos in New Mexico. We range the state. We have different languages. We have different ceremonies and different dances and different songs. We're different, and being able to share just that much, I think, would help people understand a whole lot more than they do when they just hear Native American or American Indian. And each of these terms come out of different moments in history, and in another couple of decades, maybe we won't be using Indigenous anymore. The things are very fluid. These are, and that doesn't make us less authentic too. It's really ridiculous to me that people think, well, you're not wearing feathers, so you're not a real Indian. I'm like, people change with time, and certain activities that any people does or do happens in a certain time and place. People who go to church wear certain clothes when they go to their churches. I wear certain things when I go to certain ceremonies. Just because I'm wearing these clothes here tonight doesn't make me less authentic. It's hard. It's so basic to me, but it's so hard to get some of these ideas across.
Right. It's like Groundhog's Day. You're probably always saying it, right? So here's Linda Sue Park is on, and she says, "Yay!"
Hi, Linda.
She says, "It seems a staggering task to change the way history is taught in our schools, where the accepted narrative has erased the stories of nearly all Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There is overwhelmingly systemic resistance to dismantling the canon. Do you think it's possible to accomplish this one teacher at a time?"
I think that's the only way we can do it, is one teacher at a time. Going back to, again, what I talked about earlier, these ripples of that we can affect change. We have to start with where we are in a moment, and hope that and encourage people to share that information. It's not going to be easy, because politics of the world right now seem especially difficult to make room for all of us to have good lives, being the people that our ancestors were. It's a tough time.
Yeah, it really is a tough time.
It is. I have I want to show you a book that is coming out, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I adapted it with one of my colleagues, and it's for young people, and it'll be out in June. And hope that teachers will, and Linda and people will get a copy of it and use it with kids in classrooms and help them to erase some of the misinformation that they have, and replace it with more substance.
That's fantastic. And everyone, we're going to be, there are a lot of questions that we have, or I know that Debbie has resources that are address them on her site. So we will, of course, be sending you there and sending you resources. And folks are asking for, lists and your favorite books and all that. So
I've got them. They're on my website. The Best Books tab has best books each year. I try. Like the last 5 years, I started doing that.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Lots more questions.
Okay.
One is, can Debbie talk about the concept of curtains in Native American literature, please?
Yeah. Native people have been exploited by anthropology for over 100 years. And the outcome of that was that across our nations, we have become very careful of what we share. And most of the people maybe who are tuned in tonight know about Rudine Sims Bishop and her concept of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And I was going to do a workshop with some librarians in Alaska. And I thought, when I was doing my PowerPoint slides, I thought, well, I'm going to find a window and a mirror that I can use about my Pueblo self and our Pueblo nation, and how that I want to use that as a visual. And I was looking for that, and one of the searches that I did returned one of our ceremonial structures. And there was a window, an adobe structure with a window in it, but there was a curtain. And I was looking at that, and my first thought was, man, that's not going to work. And I thought, well, there's a curtain there. and like, I just took that curtain for granted, but that curtain is there because we draw the curtains when we don't want people looking in to see what we're doing. That's true of people around the world. When we are doing something that we don't want misunderstood, misrepresented, we draw a curtain, and we're careful of who we share those things with, because our ceremonies were depicted as but were depicted in ways that caused the United States government to pass policies that said you cannot practice your religions, that made it illegal for us to do that, that made it possible for government agents to come in and take our things away, our religious artifacts away. So those curtains are real. They're there to protect knowledge from being exploited and misrepresented. And so I've added, I saw Dr. Bishop recently, and I talked with her about this idea that I'm adding curtains to her metaphor. Was that okay? And she thought, yep, she's seen that and thought it was fine. So expanding that metaphor to make it work in another way for Native people, for any people, really. And the interesting thing about that is when I talk about that, a lot of people will say, well, you're trying to censor, you know, that's not okay. The First Amendment, we, in the United States, we should have access to anything we want to. And all of this rhetoric about this nation comes out. And the fact is, lots of stuff is kept from the public eye for various reasons.
You know, that is really a wonderful point. That's not often accounted for in how we think about representation.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you actually don't have a right to represent. Not everything wants to be represented. Not everything, right of mine, and that you don't. Yeah, we shouldn't necessarily have access to everything. That
Right, you can't even go into the Vatican. You know, you can't just walk into the Vatican and go into any room that you want to. That is a protected space.
no, and as you said about the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And there's clearly, you know, some norms around how the Bible can be used and in what context,
Yeah.
and those are not questioned for the most part. I
Yeah.
wonder, that's a nice segue into, you know, a general set of questions around cultural appropriation,
Yeah.
which, you know, begun to speak to, but a lot of people concerned about that. You know, yes, how do you, what is the line, right, between sort of respectful engagement and cultural appropriation? You spoke to it a little bit in the context of children, right, and trying to engage children in a range of ways. Can you say a bit more about that, if you have any guidance to offer?
It is massive, and the appropriation, I mean, is massive, and being able to understand something that is that big is hard. I guess the questions that I would ask is, what are you doing? Who is it supposed to represent? And why are you doing it? Kind of a self-reflection on the activity that you might want to do, and some honest interaction, reflection with yourself about what you're trying to do, because I really don't think it's most of the stuff, I would say, it's just not okay. It's not okay to dress up like an Indian. If you're gonna, you know, people want to dress up like pilgrims and Indians at Thanksgiving, and the question is, all right, so who exactly are you dressing up as? And if you don't know what nation you would have in this first Thanksgiving reenactment, if you can't name the nation, then you need to stop, because what you're going to do is reproduce stereotypical construction paper feather bags and headbands, and you're just going to use this massive misinformation that you're carrying around to do something that may actually be quite hurtful, especially to Native kids in your classroom that you don't know are Native. I think that's another piece, is a lot of people don't know they have Native kids in their classroom because they don't have dark hair and high cheekbones, and so the assumption is they're not Native, and there are no Natives in the classroom. Never make that assumption, because there may be. That got away from appropriation, but I think that this book, that Lessons from Turtle Island, takes up some of that conversation really well.
And we'll include that in resources so you all can find that. There's a question here. There's so many good questions, right? One, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but do you recommend books by Sherman Alexie?
I do not. I do not. One of my own learnings in the last few years is it's been a hard one, and so I can talk about it with two books in particular. With his book, when it came out, it was exciting, because we had someone who was Native writing for children and experiencing success that no one had had before. That was exciting, and it was set in the present day. And I read the book the first time I read it, and it made me laugh in parts, and I thought that it was a book that I would recommend. But then other friends started talking about it, and Native friends and gay friends, and I revisited the content of that book and kind of felt myself pulling away from it. And since it came out, I have done some really close analysis of it and studies of Alexei himself and how he has shaped the mainstream expectation of what a Native story should be like, and it's just not good. And it's pretty bad because, for example, there's a lot of alcoholism in that book and a lot of abuse of alcohol in his young adult diary, Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And in his speaking engagements, and there's one online, he talks about, he says, if a Native person tells you there's no alcoholism in their family, they're lying to you. Every Native family has alcoholism. They are in denial. That's not true. And he says that enough and in enough places that librarians think, okay, if a book does not have someone who's an alcoholic in it, then it's not an authentic book about Native communities or Native families. That's not true. That there are research studies that document that the incidence of alcoholism in Native and non-Native families is the same. It's not different. So a book like that can create an expectation that is actually harmful to other books that don't have that, but harmful to Native people too, because then the expectation is, oh yeah, all of you guys have drunken uncles and you all have alcohol is a major problem. It's this, it occurs at the same rate. That's so important to know. And so that's one piece of his work that is troublesome. There were also writings about sexual harassment, and that was a concern for me too. And the American Indian Library Association withdrew the award that they gave to his book because of that. There's a strong, within Native communities, there's a strong community ethic about care for community, and that was seen and is seen as a violation of the care for community.
Thank you for that, Debbie. We have quite a few people asking about how to support their own Native children, and so some are very specific, but so specific that it might be too specific of a question. But I wonder, I've heard you talk, or maybe I've read a bit of you talking about what you did with your daughter when you came across these stereotypes in literature or on TV or at school. And, I thought it was actually a really helpful response. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Actually, I wonder if I can piggyback on that, Debbie.
Okay.
Because there are another set of questions that I'm sure you've, again, fielded many times, but it's about, yes, the classic books, right? Like Little House on the Prairie, that feature images, representations of Native peoples that are admittedly problematic, right? So you have the occasion of the parent who, perhaps wants to engage with books anyway. I guess I have two questions related to that then. One is, some folks, whatever the nature of the problem, right, or some books, some people who really think about these sorts of identity and representation issues will say, you know what, there are lots of good books out there, don't engage that one, right? Choose among the good books. And other folks will say, no, you can engage any book, they're just better and worse ways of doing it. So with respect to dealing with stereotypes in general and stereotypical and other problematic images in books like Little House on the Prairie, what's your advice on that?
So basically, the question is, what can or should a Native parent do about a book like Little House on the Prairie? How can that Native parent help their child with that?
And even a non-Native parent with a non-Native child, right? Just
okay.
Let's say a white. No, there are different questions, but
okay,
it's a question of engaging this content or not, and how.
A lot of parents think that they can edit and pause and have conversations with their child with a book like Little House on the Prairie when they come to the bad parts. But as they go through that, they keep editing more and more. And some parents said, forget it, I quit. We wasted all this time on this, editing this book. So I think what a parent should do is if they want to use something like that, they should read it themselves first, front to back, very carefully, very critically, and then give it some thought whether or not they want to go ahead and read that book with their kid, and or how they are going to approach their teacher, the child's teacher, about that in the classroom. I really want all parents to raise these questions with teachers, because what happened with our daughter is that we would go in 3rd grade, 4th grade, when Little House on the Prairie is taught in her school that she was in, a neighborhood school. Every time a Native family was in the school, that's when they wouldn't use the book. The Native family moves on, they bring the book back out. That's horrendous. That wasn't learning anything. But if parents did that every year, pretty soon teachers are going to really move. I think teachers will really embrace the message that this book is not acceptable for use in a school classroom. I think part of what happens when we try to go ahead and use those classic books and try to, in a classroom, and try to push back on them in the classroom, is that the weight of that is on the Native child in the classroom. The may be learning, but it's at the cost of the well-being of the Native child. And all these children are going to move from this moment when their teacher's reading this book and talking about its racist characters and qualities, to taking a spelling test or a math test. And the children who are Native, in this case we're talking about Native kids, are carrying this burden, this emotional burden, into that test-taking situation. That's not fair. That's not fair to them, because these are high-stakes tests we know about, whether it's a spelling test or whether it's a standardized test or whatever it is. They should not be asked to carry that burden. That kind of activity does not have to happen in a classroom. I lost your audio.
Sorry about that. We've
Okay.
had several questions as well about dual language books.
Yeah.
So let me ask one in particular. Do you have any children's dual language books in English and any of the Indigenous First Peoples or native languages? If you do, which ones are good to use with the younger school-age children? Oh, there it is.
This is on the tip sheet. We Are Grateful by Cherokee writer Tracy Sorrell. It's got Cherokee language all through it, and it's a year-long look at seasons and activities and events in a Cherokee year. So that one is one that I would highly recommend. It's nonfiction, and here's Richard Van Camp's picture book, and We Sang You Home, but it's also in Cree. So I highly recommend these books, and I do have several examples of books like that on my website. Definitely, yeah.
So if someone's looking for children's books with Native Two-Spirit characters for children in their extended Mashpee Wampanoag family, there's one great one titled 47,000 Bees by Lakota Two-Spirit activists. Are there others that you recommend?
The only one that I know of, or that's coming to mind right now, is Oasis. I wrote a review of that on my website, and it's not Two-Spirit in the way that I think that this family is looking for. What it has is a gender-neutral pronoun in it that I came to it, and it just took me up short. It was wonderful to come across it. There's Native language in that book as well. I don't have copyright in front of me, but that's one I would recommend. Now, I'm not sure about 47,000 beats. I haven't gotten a copy of it. I'm having a hard time getting a copy of it. But one of the concerns I have with that, it is about that idea of two-spirit. I think we're kind of moving into a kind of a pan-Indian, kind of like, it's not quite like stereotype, but there's differences across nations, and I think it'd be hard for us to really go there with those books until people of those nations are writing those books. And that's not happening in picture books yet, that I know.
Okay, it's really helpful. So it's that time. I mean, this went very quickly, and for us anyway, Debbie, I know it's after a long day for you. We really appreciate your coming on. I want everyone to know that we will send you the video tomorrow of this presentation, and as well as Debbie's tip sheet. And a week from now, a week or next week sometime, it could be a few more days than a week, we'll send you a transcript of the conversation along with the resources mentioned here. And if there are any others that people want to send me, or that Debbie wants to send me, I can add those as well. I mean, there's a lot happening in the chat that I can resurrect as well. So
Debbie, we so appreciate your activism,
yeah,
and your knowledge, the information you provide here and in your work.
yeah.
And
Thank you.
certainly, thank you so much for coming and sharing all of it with
I
our.
hope it was good.
Yeah,
And
no,
that's
thank you
great.
for engaging, and we will bring it forward, and we'll all be at our libraries and our schools, and I hope everyone learns to use Debbie's site and follow her on Twitter, please.
And use native books all the time, not just in November.
Absolutely, right.
And thanks to all of you who tuned in.
Yeah, it was a really great conversation in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Alrighty.
Debbie.
Good
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.